In this lesson, we're going to focus on setting up our test suite to allow us to test our tasks as well. Now you might say, what is there to set up? Everything's already configured. We could just add another test case right here for a task-specific endpoint, and you'd be right. The only problem with the current approach is that this is the user test suite. We want to create a separate test suite for tasks. We don't want all of the test cases for our entire project to live in the exact same file, and as we do a bit of refactoring with our test suites, we'll also take some time to pull other code out of this user test suite, such as the code up above, responsible for resetting the database to a nice starting point. Now, the reason we're doing that is right now, this code is only running for the user test suite, and we're going to want to run this code for our task tests as well. So let's go ahead and kick things off by first deleting math.js and math.test.js, two files we're no longer going to need. I'll remove math.js from the source directory. Let's start there, and then down below from the tests folder, we're going to remove math.test.js. And once both of those are gone, our test suite should be back to its expected working state, and right here it is. We have 10 passing tests, and they all exist in this one test suite, user.test.js. Now from here, we're going to create a second test suite. That means we'll be adding a new file to our tests directory. Right here, we're going to call this one task.test.js, and we're actually going to kick things off by creating a test case that makes sure tasks can be created as we would expect. Now down below, we can see our new test suite is failing, and that's because there's no test cases inside of here. Once we actually create that first test, things will start to work once again. Now to kick things off, what we're going to do is load in some stuff we'll need. I'll start by creating the const request so I can load in supertest by requiring it. And once we have that in place, I'm also going to load in the task model, something we'll be using in this file. So right here, const. Now we want to grab the task model defined over in source models task.js, and down below it is our export. That means right here, we can create a constant called task and require it. That is ... to get out of the tests directory, /source, then /models/task. Now, with this in place, let's go ahead and create our very first test case for this one. Right here, we'll go ahead and call test. I'll provide a name for this one, should create task for user, and then we'll go ahead and set up the actual function down below. This is where we're going to go through the process of authenticating as a given user and actually firing off the correct request to create that task. Now, what's the problem here? The problem is that we don't have access to our test user that is created and manipulated in our other test suite. We want to make sure that both of these files can get access to that test data. For the moment, we just have that one test user, but in order to test other task-related endpoints, we'll have to create some tasks in that database initially as well. So we can test that things like deleting a task or fetching your tasks actually work as expected. So for the moment, that means we can't actually fill out this test case. We're going to do a bit of refactoring related to how we set up that test data. To get started, I'm going to save this test suite. I'm going to close down index and app.js, and we're going to create a brand new file for setting up the database. That's going to live in the fixtures directory in our tests folder. So inside of here, I'll create a new file called db.js, and this is going to contain all of the code necessary to set that database up. Now to kick things off, what we want to do is make sure we create the same user data that we're currently creating over in the user test suite. Over in user.test.js, I'm going to grab this code right here, which is responsible for generating that user. I'm going to take it, cut it out of its current location, and bring it over to db.js, pasting it in. Now, we do need some stuff that we don't have in this file. For example, I need JWT, and I also need Mongoose. So right here, I'll go ahead and load both of those in. First up, I'll require Mongoose, storing it on a Mongoose variable. Then down below, I'll load in the JWT library by using require with JSON Web Token. Now we can go ahead and move back to user.test.js and remove both of those modules because they're no longer used inside of this file. All we need is request, app, and user. Now down below, this makes some problems for what we already have. Right here, we are trying to create that user, and then down below, we use the two variables defined over here quite a bit. So how are we going to remedy this situation? Well, what we're going to do is first create a function, and this function will get called to set up our data. So this will eventually be used with before each. Right here, let's go ahead and start with that. I'm going to create a constant, and I'll call this something like setup database, or configure database, or populate database, or whatever name you want to choose. Now, we're going to set this up as an async function. And for the moment, the contents of this function is going to be exactly the same as the contents of before each over here. That means I can just take these two lines, I can cut them out of their current location, bring them over to db.js, and we're ready to go. Now, the next thing we need to do is export some key values from this file so our test suites can actually use them. Right here, module.exports is going to get set equal to an object, and I'll be adding these three variables on as properties. I'll start with user1 ID, though the order isn't important, then user1, followed by, last but not least, setup database. So at this point, we have this new file, and it's exporting the stuff that user.test.js needs. So all we have to do to get the test suite back to its former working glory is to load those things in. Right over here, what does that mean for us? It means we're going to grab a few things using some object destructuring. I'm going to grab user1 ID, user1, and setup database. And we're going to grab those from the file we just created. So I'll require ./fixtures/db. Now, the two things, user1 ID and user1, those are already being used by all of the code down below. There's no need to make any changes to any of that. All we have to do to get before each working once again is to remove the function we're currently passing in and pass in setup database instead. Now, once again, the advantage of doing this is that I can simply use this one line in task.test.js to get access to all of these same features over there. Now, the only other change we need to make is over in db.js. We just added that new code which uses the user model that's sitting right here. So we need to make sure we load that in as well. Right here, const user equals. We'll use require with the following path. That is ... to get out of the fixtures directory, / ... to get out of tests, then it is source, models, user. Now, if we go ahead and save db.js and our user test suite, I would expect us to be back to that working test suite right here. It looks like everything is working as expected. We have all of our test cases passing, which is great. Now, we can actually take these same two lines exactly as they currently are, copy them to the clipboard, bring them over to task.test.js, paste them in, and now this file has access to all of that same test data. Now from user.test.js, we also want to grab this line right here that imports the app. We could manually type that out again, or we could just copy and paste it over to the new test suite. And with this in place, our test suite is now good to go. It's currently not doing much testing, but everything is set up to at least work in the long term. Now, when we have multiple test suites, each interacting with the database, there's a chance for conflict because of how Jest runs things. Jest will try to run our tests in separate test suites at the same time, and since we're depending on certain changes to the database, we can get into situations where tests fail incorrectly. For example, this sign-up test might fail because in between it creating the user and it finding the user, a test in a different file messes up the user, maybe doing something like resetting the database. So it's important to write real test cases, but it's also important to recognize that our test cases can interfere with each other if we let them. We can fix this with a simple change in package.json. All we need to do is add a new option onto the jest command alongside of the watch option. This is --run in band. That is capital I, capital B. This is going to run your tests in series, making sure that there's no overlap or chance of conflict. Now, when we change the command, we will need to use Control-C to manually shut down jest. Then we can start it up once again using up and enter, and we're good to go. Now at this point, we can actually write a test case, ensuring that a given user can indeed create a task, and that is exactly what we're going to do right now. Down below, I can see the test suite did restart, and we still have 11 passing tests, which is excellent. Right here, we'll kick things off with a call to request. Let's start by creating a constant called response, and I'm going to go ahead and use await with my call to request. We'll pass in our Express application, and in this case, I'm trying to make an HTTP post request to the following endpoint, that is /tasks. Now from here, we'll start by going ahead and setting up the authentication header. So that is .set to call the set method. Right here, authorization. Providing the value as well, bearer followed by that token. Now we still have access to this because of how we set up the DB fixtures file. We have user1 ID and user1, and right here, like we've done before, it is user1. .tokens, grabbing the first one and getting the JWT off of that object. Now with this in place, the next thing we're going to do is use send to send the necessary data. So I'll call send, providing an object. Now we know for tasks, the only thing we need to provide is a description. So right here, I'll do just that. Description equals, I can use whatever I'd like. I'll use something like from my test, and then down below, we can go ahead and use expect to expect the following status code, a 201. Now, we'll go ahead and add more to this test case in just a moment. Before we run it though, let's make sure to mark this as an async function, since we are using await right inside. Now let's run the test case and make sure it's at least working in its current state. If this is at least working, we'll expand on it, adding other assertions, and down below it is indeed functional. Now what we're going to do is use the task model to find that new task by its ID and make sure it was actually saved to the database and that it looks correct. So we have the ID on the response. Down below, I'll create a new constant lowercase t task. I'll use await with the following task.findById, like we had done plenty of times for user, and we have response.body._ID. Now, with this in place, let's go ahead and assert that we actually got something back. I'll use expect for that, and like we had done before with users, I'll expect that the task is not null. I'll start with not, then the assertion to be null. Excellent. Now we could go ahead and run things in its current state, although we could expand on our assertions even further. Now that we have the response and we have the task, for example, I could check that the descriptions line up. I could check that this user is the owner. I could check if the completed value was correctly set to false. I could check all sorts of things depending on what I'm worried about failing. Right here, let's go ahead and just make sure that the completed property on this new task is indeed false. So right here, what I'll do is expect something about the task we found in the database. I'm going to expect task.completed to be false. So right here, I can use to be or to equal, and I can pass false in. Now, once again, if I save things, the test should still be passing, as that is the default value set up for that specific field. And that is exactly what we end up getting down below. That's where I'd like to stop for this one. In the next lesson, we'll actually set up our setup database function to wipe existing tasks and create some test ones as well, so we can write more interesting test cases. I'm excited to get to that. Let's jump right in.